schools all over the world are failing, but not failing in the traditional sense of people think, they're not achieving test scores.
The first step towards deeper learning begins with you. Discover how your curiosity about your students' thinking and ideas can unlock a world of deeper understanding. Join this conversation with Dr. Ron Ritchhart as we explore the transformative power of making thinking visible. Now let's jump back into this episode with Dr. Ron Ritchhart.
My passion and interest is really thinking about how is it that we transform schools into cultures of thinking. That I think that, to a large extent, schools all over the world are failing, but not failing in the traditional sense of people think, they're not achieving test scores. I would say that schools are failing because we are striving to achieve test scores as our measure of success. Yes. Instead of thinking about our job as educators is to develop our students as powerful learners and thinkers. And the good news is that there's no dichotomy. It's not an either or, that when we create schools that are cultures of thinking, when we invest in really trying to develop our students as powerful thinkers and learners, the fact is they're going to do better on standardized tests as well, too. But I think that we tend to set the bar way too low. And so by trying to achieve and hit this very low mark, we're actually shortchanging our students.
That's exactly it. The standards are the floor and not the ceiling. And we get so hung up on reaching them that we lose sight of that.
Absolutely. My research, one of the kind of hallmarks of it is that I have learned from best practice. I study teachers who are very skilled at what they do. And one of the things that I have noticed is these teachers, they're always aware of the test. They can't just ignore that. They don't just say, I'm going to go my own way. But what I have noticed is that all of these teachers teach beyond the test. And so they never set that as their goal. They're always reaching beyond that. So they're certainly aware of what they need to do to prepare their students, but they don't set that as their ultimate goal. They're always teaching beyond the test.
I just adore that. If we get one takeaway from this entire session, what a beautiful one to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. That when, and when we do make thinking visible, we always say that, the thinking routines are incredibly powerful formative assessment tools because formative assessment is not, how far are students from getting a 100% or from getting them all correct. Formative assessment is really understanding the thinking that students are engaged in, where they might have misconceptions, where they might have some weaknesses, and then leaning into that so that we can build on their thinking, build on their current understanding, and enhance that further.
Yes. I love this because so much of your language is embedded in the IB. I'm an IB teacher. And when we look at assessment, the purpose of assessment is to inform teaching and learning. And so if we keep that as kind of the center, as our North Star, making thinking visible, such a powerful tool for that.
Yeah,
I love it.
Absolutely.
I've got to tell you a story. So I taught grade 5, and I think the most profound moment I've had in my grade 5 classroom was when my students came back to me and just realized that making mistakes was a good thing. And that was weird.
We have balloons.
We have balloons. Okay. But they did that using the thinking routine. I used to think, but now I think. And I think that became one of the most powerful tools in our classroom because especially in grade 5, they're so stuck sometimes in being right or getting the right answer. And to see them shift and go, oh, but now that changed my thinking. It was just such a beautiful relationship to develop with them.
The other thing that I love about that particular routine is that students have a misconception about learning. And it's a very valid, as misconceptions are, most misconceptions make a lot of sense based on people's experience. So one of the misconceptions students tend to have about learning is, learning is just the acquisition of new information. Mm-hmm. We just have new information. So it's just stacking on. It's just an accumulation. But with that routine, now I think students are able to see, that actually new learning causes a shift in our thinking. it causes us to understand things differently. It wasn't that we understood nothing about this before, but we have, we become aware of our misconceptions, we become aware of our assumptions, and that's where the learning is. And that's one reason why I really love that particular routine.
So gorgeous. So that was kind of one of my major ahas in using thinking routines. I wonder in your research if you might share some of your major aha moments that you were just like, we're onto something, or just things that really flipped your switch in the research.
Well, we wrote about this in The Power of Making Things Invisible with my colleague, Mark Church, who I've done a lot of this work with. So when we really kind of thought about, well, what is it that we're noticing about how teachers are effectively using thinking routines? Because thinking routines have become popular. They aren't
Mhm.
always used most effectively. But what we noticed there was that in addition to the routine, they weren't teachers weren't relying on the routine to do all of the work itself, but they surrounded that routine with really powerful questioning, powerful listening, and many times documentation as well. And so when we think about those four practices, routines, listening, questioning, and documentation, those are all ways to make thinking visible. And so rather than thinking about them only in isolation, which certainly we can, but they're really kind of powerful as a quartet to really support. And that was an aha
Cool.
for me because I have produced a lot of videos of teachers using thinking routines. I've also written lots of pictures of practice and case studies of teachers doing that. And in that process, then I'm always making decisions. Oh, I'm going to film this, not that. I'm going to write about this, not that. And it was an aha for me that, all of the things that I'm choosing to write about, it's because it's not just the teacher doing the routine, but it's really becomes powerful because there's that listening, that questioning, and many times the documentation around that kind of support that. So if people
Mm.
are familiar with any of the videos or go back and look at those or subscribe to the YouTube channel there, that's one thing I would really encourage people to look at, to think about how is the routine kind of situated in this broader ecological kind of context.
Embedded in the culture. Yeah, it's not just a standalone piece.
Right.
Love that. You describe making thinking visible as a broad goal of teaching, as well as a set of practices for supporting that goal. Might you elaborate on that? I feel like it's a slight tweak in how we think about it, but it's very powerful.
Yeah. And again, that really kind of comes down to how do teachers use the routine kind of
Mm,
most effectively. So rather than teachers thinking, oh, I've been told by someone to use thinking routines, or I'm supposed to use them, or I, insert them, or, oh, this is a great way to kind of jazz up a lesson. Those teachers have broader goals. So one goal clearly is the idea of, I want a window into my students' thinking.
yes.
I know for me to be a better teacher, I need to understand where my students are at with this particular content, with this material. And so they're always thinking about, well, what is it that will give me a window in? How can I get that window in? They also have the goal of, and recognizing this, it's one of the mindsets that I've written about in the latest book, that learning is a consequence of thinking. So they don't see thinking as, we'll do a little bit of thinking if we have time, but
Right.
they recognize, I do want my students to learn this. So with this content, what's the thinking I need them to do? And then how might I
Gorgeous.
support that thinking? And so the routines become in that. And I think that another kind of goal that we sometimes talk about is that we notice in teachers is they become students of their students. So they are really curious about their students. So again, that's a real step back or a step out of that teacher as the deliverer of content. I'm going to give you this content, and now your job is to do all of the thinking, all the learning, all of the work to kind of make this make sense. But they kind of recognize, I am just fascinated by this process of learning. And the thinking routines wind up being great physical vehicles for better understanding the learning that is happening. So when teachers kind of embrace those goals, they naturally see the thinking routines as really kind of powerful tools that they can use. So they see them, and we often talk about them as tools, But as with any tool, you have to think about, well, what's the purpose of this tool? What is
Mm.
this tool going to achieve? Why am I choosing this tool versus that tool? And that's what enables teachers to really kind of step into that very, very powerful space of using the routines most effectively.
You're watching the School Leaders Project, brought to you by Toddle, the world's first ever AI-powered learning management system. With Toddle, your curriculum planning, daily lesson plans, and parent communications flow together seamlessly in one beautiful and connected system. So what I'm hearing is it's the mindset first. It's the I'm going to get curious about my learners. It's the why, and
Hmm.
then the routines almost become the how or the what we're doing, but the main goal there is that partnership with your learners and that curiosity of who they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we noticed, and again, this would be something that we have found about why the thinking routines are so incredibly useful and so incredibly powerful, that as teachers begin to kind of think about building a culture of thinking in their classroom and really supporting their students, one thing that we have seen over and over again is that teachers often will underestimate their students as
Hmm.
thinkers. They will say, oh, they don't know enough about this. Oh, they can't do this. Oh, they're not going to, and so they will underestimate. And so the thinking routines, when teachers begin to use them and they recognize, oh,
My,
the
my,
students
my.
really do have a lot of great thinking around this. They have a lot of, great ideas. There's a lots of things that I can build on here. This is really interesting. So it allows them then to become curious
Hmm.
about their students in the best sense. We have found that over and over again, that then, teachers become very interested in, seeing their students and making their thinking visible so that, again, that gives them more information, but that curiosity is what really drives their use there. So we think the thinking routines actually are a great place to start in terms of building a culture of thinking, because it gives teachers something very concrete to do. It puts thinking on the table, and it really helps to develop that curiosity.
I'm so glad you said that, Ron, because sometimes it feels almost like the chicken and the egg. When you're first getting started with inquiry practice, it just feels so daunting and intimidating. And one of the things that I love about introducing visible thinking routines is they're just such an early, easy win that you can have as a teacher who's
Hmm.
maybe brand new to inquiry, and you can do a thinking routine and kind of go, oh, so maybe even if you're not implementing it in the best way yet, or your mindset's not there yet, it's like that training wheel that can lead you down this path of changing your mindset.
Absolutely. I think that there does need to be that inkling there of
Right.
being curious about your students. I have seen, and there had read some blogs of people kind of dismissing thinking routines. And what I noticed in that dismissal of the thinking routines is the teacher really was not curious about their students thinking. The teacher was like, I can get this material across so much more efficiently.
Okay.
Why would I want to use a thinking routine when I can just tell them? Or their response was, students can't, again, underestimate, students can't really do this. They can't think about this. The material is too new. They just don't know enough. And so if you view your students as deficient and you're the person that has to fill them up, then the thinking routines feel like, well, this is just
Mhm.
an inefficient thing. So there does have to be that inkling of curiosity, that bit of respect for the students. In Reggio Emilia preschools, they talk about our image of the child,
Yeah.
and of course they're working in an early childhood space. But our image of our students, the image of the students we teach, will determine a lot about how we teach. So if in my experience, having taught, from preschool to university, I have met people at every single level that will see their students as deficient. You can
Mm.
meet people at the, undergraduate level at university saying, no, no, students can't do this. They just don't know enough. They have to wait until they're in grad school. That's when they can really think. So you can always underestimate people. You can
Yeah.
always see them deficient in some way. But instead, if you look at, well, what do they bring? What do
Right.
they have? How might I capitalize on that? How might I uncover that? I think that's what makes teaching exciting. I don't can't imagine, teaching from that only seeing our students as deficient. It's not a very exciting way to think about teaching. I don't think.
Well, and that comes back to the Hattie research that collective efficacy is the number one influence on student achievement. Our beliefs about our students become reality of their performance. And so if we believe that they're deficient, if we believe they can't do deep thinking, then that's exactly what we're going to see in our classroom.
Absolutely. Yep.
Love it. Okay, Ron, this question comes from my friend Claudia. She teaches in Uruguay, and I told her I was interviewing you, and she was like, oh, okay, you have to ask Ron about what is the biggest impact that you've seen in a school that has systematically implemented visible thinking as part of their culture?
Um, there are, are a couple of schools that I work with in which, the idea of cultures of thinking and using thinking routines and visible thinking are really have been embedded since the school's inception. And
Mm-hmm.
so those are schools which I love to kind of visit. Um, those students, what I notice is they're able to talk differently about their learning. They enjoy school, they enjoy being there. They're not afraid of making mistakes, not afraid of stretching themselves. So they kind of lean into that kind of challenge. So the school becomes a really, very exciting place, I think, both for the teachers as well as for the students. And within that, there's also a greater sense of community. So you
Mm.
really get the sense of there is a community of learners here. It's not like, oh, here's, there are one or two kind of high flyers that are carrying the class or doing things, or the teacher's really having to, work with these, distracted, students and worry about them. But the sense of community of everyone really supporting one another, and that's really, I think, incredible to see. I'm
Mm.
thinking in particular about one school that I have worked with since its inception. It's now 10 years old, St. Paul the Apostle in Doreen, Victoria. And, that they have actually a very, very large immigrant population. They're on the very, very outskirts of Melbourne, Australia. There, they teach in multi-age classes.
Wow.
And Phil Doherty, the principal there, he said, when I give parents, a tour, he said, they don't ask me about, the test scores. They're not asking me about that. They are so impressed with what they see our students doing, the smiles on their face. And he said, I can pull over, any student, and he literally does, any student, and ask them about their learning, ask them to explain what it means to be a member of this community and a member of the school, and what do they like about this, and how is it different from other schools. And they're just so articulate about that. And he said, when parents see that, they want to come to this school because
Gorgeous.
that's what they want. And he said, we often, again, promote this idea of test scores as the be all end all, and that's all that people are kind of concerned about. But at the end of the day, parents do really want, I want my child to be a part of a really powerful learning community. I want them to stay excited about school. I want them to love to be here.
Mm.
And when they see, kids who are doing that, and they see kids who, again, not always native English speakers to begin with, from very diverse backgrounds, and some students with learning disabilities, and they see that everyone's able to do that, that's really, really powerful and exciting.
I just like got a picture of Maslow's hierarchy in my head, right? The initial part that you discussed was this psychological safety. I'm not afraid to be wrong. I'm not afraid to show what I really think and who I really am, which leads to that sense of identity, which, it goes all the way up. But without that curiosity of how we're thinking, what we're thinking, it feels like it's impossible to build up from there in a traditional school. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think a part of that is, that safety comes from not feeling like you're constantly being compared.
Yes.
And so when you're constantly, being compared, the majority of students are going to fall short in some
Fall short
respect.
or fit in.
Yes, in some respect. And so when people feel like, eh, you know, um, that this is a supportive community. I'm not being compared. I'm growing. And I think that, at St. Paul the Apostle School, part of that in that multi-gauge classroom, the students kind of recognize, why would I think as, a third grader that I'd be on par necessarily with a fourth grader, but I'm learning
Cool.
with them and I have things to learn, from them. And so you just kind of break down that idea of constantly kind of comparing, judging, evaluating, scoring of students.
Oh, I adore it. Can we just get rid of all the scoring in schools, Ron? Can you and I just go around and just get rid of it all?
Well, what I often say is, unfortunately, those scores, those tests, those evaluations are with us.
Right.
What our job is not only to, help students kind of with that and to pay attention to that somewhat, but another big job that we have at schools as teachers and as schools in general, and this is particularly for school leadership, is we cannot let the test scores be the single story of our school. That's going to be reported in the papers. It's going to take time. It's on the schedule. There are so many things which make that the dominant story. But then we have to say, well, if I don't want that to be the dominant story, I have responsibility to tell another story. I have that responsibility to make the other story visible. And again, that's what Principal Phil Doherty does there
Mm.
is he recognizes, I don't want parents, I'm not going to bring parents in and saying, here's our test scores. Here's kind of what we're doing. I'm telling a different story.
Gorgeous.
And he's engaging the students in telling that story, and everyone knows that story at the school and is able to tell that story. There's also a lot of documentation. You can walk into the classrooms and see in their space kind of what is happening in the learning there. So that responsibility to tell a different story is, I think, one of the things we have to lean into.
Well, and it's so mirrored, and not to be gauche, but you see a culture of thinking. And it's not just something that's happening in the classroom. It's something that's happening on every level, that we're all trying to make our thinking visible to one another and work towards having that shared vision. Beautiful. Oh, I just love it. We began here, Ron, because you said that your research began with cultivating thinking dispositions, which is so funny because I feel like that has had a huge resurgence, especially in the past few years with AI. This idea of thinking dispositions. So, what would you say are the dispositions of a thinker, of a learner?
Well, in the early kind of research I did, one of the things I did was to look at and review kind of the literature of the talk about dispositions originally kind of comes from a philosophical literature. So I looked at
Mm.
various philosophers. John Dewey kind of fits in that kind of category there. But there's also psychological literature on that. There's also educational literature on that. And so I found a couple of really kind of cross-cutting dispositions. I found 6 of them that tend to be talked about kind of across the board. Lots of people have different lists. So, like Art Cost has 16 habits of mind. Around there.
IB, learner profile.
Yeah, it's a learning profile. Uh, the
Oh,
learning profile is a little bit of a kind of a grab bag of some things. I wouldn't call all of those dispositions, but some of them are. But so what I identified was, curiosity, the disposition to be metacognitive, the disposition to be skeptical and strategic, the disposition to build understanding there as being some that are incredibly kind of cross-cutting that occur over and over again.
very cool. So you've got your list of dispositions. So, and you've said a lot of curriculums have their own sets of dispositions. Might you speak to the idea of how is it different to develop a disposition versus acquiring a piece of knowledge or a set of skills?
So in the research that we did at Harvard, David Perkins, Shari Tishman, and myself, some of the early research we looked at, well, how is it that we understand what a disposition is, and how is it that we can assess, not in the terms of score, not in the terms of measure, but assess in the terms of understanding and recognize a disposition. And we identified 4 components to a disposition. So a disposition does have a skill component. So like the disposition to be curious. So you have to obviously kind of have the skills there. So a skill related to curiosity would be asking questions, and being able to ask questions would be one kind of skill there. So there certainly is that role and that importance. But what we recognize, and one reason to talk about dispositions, is that many people have the skills, but they never put them into use.
Hmm.
So part of putting them into use then relies on having the inclination. The inclination means that you see this as a valuable and a worthwhile thing to do. So another, disposition might be, again, like, being strategic and skeptical. So what a subcomponent of that would be being able to recognize bias. So again, most people actually have that skill. They can recognize kind of bias, but many people fail to do. So you need to be inclined to kind of recognize, well, this is something worthwhile. This is something of value. The third component is where we found the biggest kind of breakdown. So in our research there, we found this is the component of dispositions that often is lacking. We called it kind of the bottleneck, and that is awareness of occasions. So you have to be able to spot, this is a time that I actually should, pay attention. And I might look at that bias. So you mentioned, AI and things. So that's one of the things where, your results from ChatGPT, you need to be skeptical of that and recognize you don't know where this information is being pulled from and whether this information is accurate. So you need to read that with a highly kind of skeptical eye. So you need to be able to spot, this is an occasion to do that.
Cool.
And what we found was that many people just fail to spot the occasion. So they fail to spot, here's where I need to actually do that. And then the fourth component is motivation in the moment. So inclination is a broad valuing. You see it as important and worthwhile, but motivation is, okay, well, right now, in this moment, am I motivated to expend the energy? And a lot of times when it comes to that motivation, particularly in schools, we as teachers or schools in general put in place disincentives. So curiosity is a very good example from that. So students are curious and we say, oh, well, where's the curiosity gone? Why aren't students curious? Students may recognize, this topic is really of interest. I could be curious about this, but I've got 4 other papers to write tonight. And this assignment is not that, important, and this only counts that much. So I even just by the occasion, I could be curious here, but there's no time. So within that moment, we've got a disincentive. So there's no motivation to actually, this is actually, kind of worth it, to me. From my own experience, of being in schools for a very, very, very long time is particularly at university, as soon as I was able to opt out of grades for courses and able just to take courses past fail, I did that because I recognized that the grades kept me from being curious because I still wanted a good grade. I still wanted to be a good
I'm
student.
guilty of that.
And when I didn't have to worry about that, I could say, without that pressure, without that disincentive, that's focusing me on conforming, trying to please the teacher, trying to get them, I could take assignments and do much more interesting things with them, and I could explore curiosity because I no longer had that disincentive to that. So I recognized that was a demotivator for me in terms of actually developing this the sense of curiosity, the sense of adventuresomeness in terms of kind of leaning in and trying new things there. So those 4 components, the idea, yes, we need skills, but we also need that broad inclination. We need to be able to spot occasions, and then we need that motivation in the moment. So a lot of things that we do in schools, we focus on that skill component, which again, we do need that.
Right.
Where again, when we think about this bottleneck of awareness, another very, very big issue in schools is that we rob students of the opportunity to spot occasions because we tell them.
We're practicing.
Yes,
Curiosity right now.
here's
Yeah.
exactly what you need to do.
Right.
And so we tell them, here's the skill, here's the ability you need to activate, and we tell them here's exactly, what you need to do.
Hmm.
So we could find, and you can, just without elaborating too much in terms of what our research is and where we could see this is, you could give people a prompt and say, give them a scenario, give them, something to look at and ask them to kind of analyze that. And then, they give you some kind of response. And then you could take that response and say, now pay attention and look for where there might be bias in this. And they can do it.
Hmm.
But when you didn't tell them, they didn't spot the bias.
So
So
there
when you
won't be transfer.
Yeah. So when you told them exactly, oh, here's what I need you to do, they could do it. So they weren't actually engaged in that. And so many times in schools, we spot all of the occasions for
Hmm.
students. We tell them exactly what skill they need to apply. And so again, yes, that issue of transfer, again, with any skill component, it's recognizing, I see this here. Here's the skill I need to apply. Here's the ability I need to activate in this particular kind of situation. And so that ability to spot occasions is really kind of crucial.
So it's that tension between scaffolding the development of the disposition and then also giving kind of that agency and free rein to feel the disposition authentically in real world contexts.
Yeah, I think that teachers, by and large, tend to, we tend to misunderstand what scaffolding is.
Hmm.
So if you literally take that metaphor, a scaffold is used to help you reach higher levels than what you could reach on your own. And so if you think about that's what a scaffold does. So that means you have to know what a student can reach on their own
Hmm.
and what is just outside their grasp. And when it's there, that's when you provide the scaffold. But we tend to misunderstand scaffolding as merely structuring. And so teachers will overstructure tasks because that ensures success.
Hmm.
So I think many times what we as teachers are guilty of is we create the illusion of learning because we provide so many structures that walk kids through kind of step by step, and they do that, and it looks like they've been successful, but they have really not done the thinking. They have not really applied things. We have ensured that they have completed the task, and we look at the completed task as an indicator of learning. And many times it's not. It's just a completed task that was heavily completed through the scaffolding that the adult provided there. So scaffolding is really a responsive action to a need. And so, as teachers, when we think about, so it is very, very important within, the problems, the task, the assignments. Are thinking we need to think about, well, where might students struggle? Where might they have difficulty? How might I help them with that? But we
Hmm.
provide that when it is needed. So it's response to a shown need. When we provide it all in advance, we have over scaffolded for many times, 80 or 90% of our students. And not everybody needed that. And so we've actually robbed them of their ability to actually learn from that task because of our overstructuring. So, yes, scaffolding is really important, but thinking about it as being responsive to a need that a student is showing.
I think I'm going to come back to this question a lot or this thought from you a lot of how am I disincentivizing thinking? Even just the scaffolding piece that you're describing there is it's disincentivizing the thinking. It's disincentivizing the opportunity to demonstrate a disposition. So like what a beautiful question to ask educators at the end of a planning session. Now go back and see where along the way that might be disincentivizing that deep thought.
Yep.
Very, very cool. All right. So I think a lot of this run can feel really heady or really conceptual. And I'm wondering if we have a school leader who's feeling jazzed about making thinking visible, creating that culture in their school. How do you really start that? Where's an accessible starting point for us?
Well, again, so kind of starting with that idea of this as a goal. So, that we need to understand our students' thinking. That gives us very valuable insights. So, how might we better understand our students' thinking around this particular concept we're teaching, this new kind of context there? Um, how can we get a window in? So, that again, that expression of the goal, putting that out there as a goal.
Hmm.
Um, and then I think it is very useful. So, I talked about the idea of listening, questioning, documentation, and thinking routines. Questioning is something that all teachers do. So that's in a very, I always like to kind of begin with where people are already successful, where they're already doing, kind of recognize it's not something new I want you to do, but you're already doing some of this. Let's build on what you're doing that is successful. So, if I were a school leader, I might ask, what are some questions that, we as teachers have collectively asked this week that really gave us insight into our students' thinking. So to kind of recognize, we're already doing some of this. And so beginning to talk about those insights in our students' thinking, and then think about how do we expand that kind of repertoire. There, the simplest routine to start with is itself a question, and that question is, what makes you say that? So it's a simple invitation for a student to elaborate, to explain, to justify, to give evidence around that. Gives us a real window in, something easy for teachers to do, doesn't require a lot of planning. Again, as a school leader, just to share that with teachers and say, this week, just see when and where you can insert that. Whenever it's going to be an easy thing to do because it doesn't require new planning, new steps. And again, begin to talk about that. So that can kind of get the ball rolling in terms of, now we've become curious about our students' thinking. Now we're seeing more insights. Now it's helping us to plan more effectively. So then let's expand that. What are some other ways that we, might begin to get more insights into thinking and then begin to use some of the thinking routines there?
Beautiful. And that's so opposite of how you sometimes see it enacted in schools, right? It's, hey, here's the Project Zero, here's the thinking routines website. Go pick one for your unit and start it and try it. As opposed to where are you currently at and what are those ways that we might just enhance what's already happening? So a really accessible a way to think about that.
Yeah, I think that everyone just kind of appreciates that this is something that they are already doing to some extent.
Mm.
Highlight that, lean into that, and then enhance what's already there.
Can I just
And then,
ask you to
I mean,
ask
the other
me
thing,
what makes you say that one time? Because it would just make my whole life complete.
I mean, the other thing that I would say, particularly to school leaders, is rather than people sending people necessarily to the book or the website, is when school leaders use thinking routines within their own professional learning with teachers, that's the best way of learning a routine because the thinking
Yes.
routines are not activities that we do with students. They're tools for learners. And so whenever we're in a learning situation, they can be really valuable tools for us.
Beautiful. I have to give a shout out to my college professor, Dr. Carolyn Hopp, and she first introduced me to thinking routines, and she introduced me to a See Think Wonder for a Norman Rockwell painting of Ruby Bridges. And I how many years was I in school? And that's one of those learning experiences that just resonated with me because I just felt it. I felt what inquiry was really for the first time. And you're so right that it's just so much more powerful to experience them for yourself.
Mm-hmm. It
So
is.
cool.
Yeah. And that then also, it helps us then to use them more effectively in the classroom because then we understand what it feels like as a learner, where there might be tensions, where there might be struggles, how we kind of push through that. And then we're able to help our students do the same.